This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Christopher Miller. He's a journalist with Radio Free Europe and he's been covering the war in East Ukraine since the very start. In fact, he actually lived in the Donbass region where the war currently is before the war even broke out. He'll be giving us some updates on the state of the war in East Ukraine. It's a conflict that many people seem to have forgotten is still going on. It is, however, the biggest ongoing conflict in Europe. Many young men are dying on the front lines every single week. So Christopher Miller is going to give us an insight into what is carrying this war on and what might happen in the future. If you want more from the podcast, go to patreon.com/popularfront. You can support us there, get bonus episodes, join the Discord, all sorts of stuff. This episode is sponsored by defensepost.com. What the hell is going on in Ukraine, I guess? Because, you know, as we both know, the war is not over. The ceasefire isn't holding, yet you never see anything about it in the news. What is going on?
Yeah, well, you know, it's more than 4 years now since this war began, and it's still very much an active conflict. You know, for people who actually follow, you know, pretty closely, they will have heard this line that's now being used by President Petro Poroshenko and the Ukrainian government, as well as the U.S. envoy to the Ukraine conflict, Kurt Volker, that the war is not a frozen conflict, it's a hot war. You know, as much as that is a line, it's true. You know, it's still very much an active conflict with a static front line, but there's still shooting all day, every day. You know, everything from small arms to heavy weapons are still being used. Not necessarily to the extent that they were used in the first year and a half of the conflict, when things were really heavy and really bad and people were dying in large numbers on a daily basis. You know, but it's still happening. And, you know, I think on average, one Ukrainian soldier dies every 2 or 3 days. And sometimes we see flashes where 4, 6, 8 are killed in a couple day, or like a 48-hour period. And, you know, casualties are still in the double digits on a weekly basis. Civilians are also taking a toll. You know, it's not like this is happening in a deserted area. Eastern Ukraine is a heavily populated place, and the region that is considered to be the active war zone is about the same size as the U.S. state of Maryland. And there's 4 million people that live across it, and I think around 400,000 that live right up against on either side of the front line. So you can see that, like, you know, with the way that the war is going now, which is more or less, you know, simmering, because it's still happening, just not with the same intensity, like I said before, as it previously was. You know, it's still ongoing. It's still affecting the lives of you know, civilians who are caught in the crossfire or live just out of range, but are affected nonetheless because they have to cross to and from this contact line, or this conflict line, you know, for medical services, for pensions, for you know, to see family, friends, whatever. Yeah, you know, and I think it's, you mentioned that it's not being covered, and I think, you know, to the extent that it had been covered before, certainly it's not getting that same attention, right? But I think the reason is because not a lot has changed on the ground in the last 2 years, and, you know, it's a war of attrition, and the men and women that are fighting on the front lines are just wearing each other down, and a lot of the people who followed the conflict intensely at the start have also kind of been worn down because not a lot has happened, right?
Yeah, I remember, I think the last time I was in Avdiivka, like over a year ago now, this guy was like, oh, we took this amount of ground, and he was talking about this trench that they took from the separatists, and it was like 3 or 4 meters, honestly. It was nothing, you know, and they kind of considered this as this, like, kind of, you know, oh, we're pushing forward now. And I just thought, not really, you know what I mean? It's all pretty static.
Yeah, and well, that's no. So that is actually still happening, which might be one of the most interesting things that is still kind of happening, and that is this creeping advance or creeping offensive on the Ukrainian side. Now, I get flack for even using that term, but it's actually a term that was first used by Ukrainian media, not myself. But like you said, in Avdiivka, when these guys were creeping, kind of forward meter by meter, that is something that's been going on since, let's see, December 2016, when the military kind of put forward this idea that it would move ahead, meter by meter or kilometer by kilometer, to try to take more strategic positions. What they said, the positions they said would be to allow them a better defense should Russia launch an all-out invasion. But really, what it is this idea and policy of retaking ground without violating the Minsk peace deal agreements. So just this week, there was another update from one of the Ukrainian military's top commanders, who said that they've taken a total of about, I think, 15 square kilometers of territory in the gray zone, which is that buffer area, not necessarily a no man's land because civilians still live there, but that area between the two sides' front lines. And so the Ukrainians have continued to do this since December 2016, and they're taking little territories here and there around where Debaltseve is located, which was one of the most intense battles of the conflict in winter 2015. Pushing there and pushing toward Gorlovka nearby, which is another strategic city. So that's one of the really interesting things that not a lot of people are paying attention to, because it's not very sexy, and they're not taking a lot of territory, but it is still happening. And actually, one of the other, if you want me to keep on talking about this, I don't know how into the weeds you want to get, but I think it's really interesting to kind of follow what Ukraine is doing, because they're going in and they're quote, retaking cities or liberating towns by doing this. But what they're doing in some cases is just moving into a town that already is under the control of the government, even if it is in the technical gray zone or kind of this buffer zone. They're getting aid from the government. Volunteers are still reaching them. Humanitarian aid is still reaching them. They still have communication with the central government in Kiev and the regional government, and the Ukrainian military will move in and raise a flag over a building and say, hey, we liberated this town, and villagers will say, we were never under anybody's occupation. We've been more or less free and unoccupied here, and now you're making us targets because you're moving in and positioning weaponry near schools or near parks, or more generally in just populated areas. Now the other side is doing that too. So I get pounced on by Kiev supporters and Ukrainians for saying this, but the other side is doing this too. There is also the same thing happening on the part of the Russia-backed separatists in the DNR and LNR. So both sides are doing this. It's just that Ukraine is doing it to a slightly greater extent than the other side is.
And why are they doing that? Is it just for show, just to be like, look, we took some ground in the media, or what? Like, it seems like an odd tactic.
Yeah, it's certainly an odd tactic. I mean, I think it has a lot of propaganda value. It's not only folks in the West or outside of Ukraine, anywhere in the world, who have lost interest in the conflict. Ukrainians also, polls show, are interested in the conflict, but they're not getting information about it from their media. So there was this really interesting study, just to back up a little bit here and provide a little bit of context. I think it was in January or February, one of the polling organizations in Kiev found that of the top 6 television stations only 2% of all news programming was focused on the conflict. And so it's not being talked about in Ukrainian society either, even though polls show Ukrainians would like to know more about it and that it's the most important issue that needs to be settled, right? And so, I find that to be a really, really interesting thing. But I think this, this campaign is one of the few things that is getting media coverage, and it's because Ukraine kind of needs a win, right? Like this conflict has no end in sight. Parliamentary and presidential elections are coming up in 2019. President Poroshenko is deeply unpopular. His government is deeply unpopular. And the one area where he does kind of shine, or at least he does have a greater level of popularity, is in the realm of the military, because he's seen as having put millions and millions of dollars into the military and really kind of, raising it from the grave. Before this war, I mean, it was nothing. It had been completely disassembled. Money had been reallocated elsewhere. The military was a shell of its former self. It was essentially nothing, like since the fall of the Soviet Union to about 2014, and then it had to act and get built up, and Poroshenko, to his credit, has managed to do that. But the war is controversial. Everything outside of the military is still seen as being very corrupt, and Poroshenko is not very popular. But when it comes to the military, it is. And if the military keeps showing progress and showing that it's strong, that it can rebuff any kind of Russian attack, that's going to be something that keeps a sort of positivity focused on Poroshenko and his government. And I think that's probably the biggest part of it, because I've been to some of these places where they've retaken ground, the military that is, and their argument, the military's argument is that these are strategic points, maybe a hilltop, with a better view, or maybe an area that they needed to take before the other side did, because it would have been advantageous for Russian-backed forces to hold that, and a good place to launch an assault from. I've been to these places, and I'm not a military expert, but I just don't see it. And it's in some cases so little ground, like you were saying. They had moved forward maybe 3 or 4 meters. I mean, I don't know if that's if that's hyperbole, and you're not. Maybe it was a little bit more ground, but it really is like a very little piece of space in some cases, and I just don't see the value in that, especially given that it costs. It costs soldiers' lives in some cases, right? If you remember the last time they did this in this little town of Chiri, near Gorlovka, it was I think it cost 3 or 4 soldiers' lives, a hell of a lot of ammunition. Even more were wounded, and I believe there were civilian casualties as well, right? So it doesn't make a lot of sense to be doing this. So I think they must feel as though they're kind of in desperate need of a PR win.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't literally mean 4 meters, maybe 40, I don't know, or 60. But the feeling I got was from this guy. I remember he was telling me, and he showed me this like horrific video where they'd filmed in the trench, where they'd shot some DNR guy in the head and stuff. And the feeling I got, I just thought, this guy is so. They're so angry, they're on the front, no one cares. Like you said, I remember one soldier said to me, why did you even bother coming here, like as a joke, And I said, oh, well, people, in the rest of Europe don't realize the war is still going on. And he said, mate, people in Kiev don't realize the war is still going on, So I kind of got this feeling they're so angry that, I mean, I don't know, but I felt as if maybe these little creeping advances just come out of, I don't know, a few shots come over and they go, right, fuck it, let's go. You know what I mean? And they just, out of desperation, I don't know. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I think certainly part of it is, in my interviews with soldiers when they were doing this in an area near Debaltseve, what was called the Svetlodarsk Bulge, in winter 2016, which I think was right before you went to Avdiivka. They had really started to push in this one area, and the soldiers that I had spoken to and their commanders were, I think, the most honest I've ever heard soldiers be in this conflict. And they said, look, we've got new guys that have no war experience. They weren't here in 2014. They weren't here in 2015 in Debaltseve when it was hot and heavy. They've got to get some practical experience. This helps with that. And then, another commander saying as well that, we've got guys that need practical experience, but also we've got to try to keep this conflict in the public eye. So like you were saying, right? Like there's people in Kiev who have kind of forgotten about this. Well, these things do help with that, right? It gives that PR win that I was saying before, but it also kind of helps put the conflict back into the public eye. And I think another aspect of that was morale. Like soldiers' morale is really, really low right now, right? Not a lot is happening. The front line is static. You got a lot of guys who really would like, even if it cost thousands of lives, would like to take offensive action. Now, I'm not saying that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. I'm just stating, these guys are bored on the front lines. And in these creeping advances, when they are able to take even 40 meters of territory or a kilometer of territory, they feel like they've done something, right? They've helped their country. They've recaptured or liberated this piece of Ukrainian land that is theirs, right? And it really does boost morale. But it doesn't last long. It only lasts for a short period of time, which is part of the reason why I think this campaign has continued on.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. One thing that reminds me of is kind of the how the militias are still pushing on and what have you, even though they're not really getting paid. What is going on now with the militias? Because you still got right sector running around. Azov seem to have splintered into a few different groups, which are causing chaos. With the beating up those Romani gypsies and what have you.
Over the last few years, Ukraine has brought these militia groups and its volunteer battalions into official folds, whether it be the National Guard, the Interior Ministry, or the Ministry of Defense. However, just like you said, there still are these volunteer, freedom-fighting, ultra-nationalist guys who have decided not to be taken into an official fold, and their loyalties are not to the government or any official military structure. Their loyalties are to one of a handful of lawless commanders.
And you're on about right sector.
So right sector is the best example of that, right? Dmitry Yarosh, who's of course one of Russia's favorite bogeymen, still leads this Duk volunteer battalion of right sector guys, or also known as Pravy sector, and they number in the several dozens, if not a few hundred, and they're still in places along the front line. They're allowed to be there, even though they're supposed to have been brought into the fold or not fight at all. They're allowed to remain at certain places on the front line. They still coordinate with the official military structure to some degree, not to a great extent, but they get on the radio and let this battalion know they're going here or whatever, just so there's no crossfire between them, right? But they're tacitly accepted, not explicitly accepted, because if you ask the military, they'll tell you on the record officially, we don't have any guys out there fighting who aren't within our official structure. But these guys aren't, and they don't want to be, and they haven't caused too much trouble in Donbass since the others were brought into these structures. They kind of do their own thing. They're not heavily involved in any of these kinds of more offensive measures or these slow kind of creeping advances that we discussed before. they kind of, keep to themselves, and they squat in homes, close to the front line, where civilians have left because of the level of violence there. And I think but Kiev leaves them alone because they would probably have a bigger problem with these guys if they tried to disarm them. We saw a couple of years ago, if you remember, this like really nasty battalion called the Tornado Battalion. A bunch of those guys were tried and convicted of really heinous crimes. And they weren't tried or charged with murder because they couldn't prove it. But in my interviews with people out in Donbass, including police commanders who came up with these guys, who came up against these guys, they said bodies were being found in the areas under their control. But these guys, when there was an attempt to bring them in, they had a firefight and a standoff with police, and I think Kiev fears that this could happen also with these right sector guys and other volunteers who number in the hundreds, not just in like the couple of dozen like these Tornado guys, right? They have not only firearms, but they've got anti-tank weapons, they've got APCs and other armored vehicles. It would really be it would be a pretty nasty fight, and there would certainly be lives lost, but also the optics to the international community and Kiev's Western backers. They would see this, and it would be a real disaster for them. So they're out there. They're still operating. They don't get a lot of attention. I think recently there was a group of them who kind of celebrated this kind of anniversary of joining the ranks. One of my colleagues at the Ukrainian service for Radio Free Europe, Liv Kostek, who doesn't report in English, unfortunately, but sometimes we collaborate on stories. He reports in Ukrainian and Russian for the Ukrainian service, Radio Svoboda's Donbass Reali. He was out there for this kind of, I think it was a swearing-in ceremony for some new volunteers, and this anniversary of the sort of Duke battalion being formed. And the photos that he shared with me showed at least 100 guys. So they're still out there, and they're still getting support from somewhere. We don't know exactly where, and that's the other issue. It's like, who's giving them money, right? But they're out there.
In the last year, I've been following right sector channels on Telegram and what have you, and I noticed a high uptick in what they were doing. So, for example, they started putting on all these training camps, and then all of a sudden they started bringing these videos out where they're quite well edited. And before that, they were just ragtag, they were never doing stuff like that, really. And I've noticed within the last year, I thought these guys are getting money from somewhere where they weren't before, you know what I mean? Because there's so much things they seem to be at least trying to show that they're doing now, whereas before I never really saw that.
Yeah, that is true. I've noticed also like new uniforms, for example, all of that kind of stuff. The money going to these groups has been incredibly difficult to track. We have some sense of where they might get it. Local businessmen with interests in specific areas in Donbass, right? They don't want their business lost to whether it be the separatists or Russia or what have you. There are oligarchs who are also backing these groups, that backed some of them in the beginning, right? People like Igor Kolomoisky, who backed the Dnipro and the Donbass battalions, early in the conflict. But as far as right sector is concerned, I can't say that I've really been able to find to a great degree of certainty who specifically is funding them. But that's one of the things that I've been kind of hoping that Ukrainian journalists would dig into. But I haven't seen a very comprehensive report done that looks at the financing of them. And there's also questions about the financing of the Azov battalion, especially now that it's getting so much attention because it's formed a political party. The group has been behind several of these attacks on Roma camps that you also mentioned, in recent months. And I think even more than Right Sector, which I think poses very little threat, actually, even though it's a favorite, boogeyman of Russia and of kind of anti-fascist folks internationally who watch Ukraine and think it's crawling with fascists, which it's not. Right Sector is this kind of like favorite group to target, but they're I think less of a threat militarily and politically than Azov is, just because Azov has not only tacit support from powerful people in government, it has explicit support from them, right, and possibly financial support from them. Azov's youth group wings get government money. They get grants to put on patriotic education camps, that sort of thing. And so I think they pose much more of a threat and are probably more interesting of a group to look at under a microscope.
Yeah, and I think for anyone that doesn't realize why that's such a threat, we should point out that Azov is quite literally a far-right battalion running around with a column of tanks. They have children's summer camps where they train kids. I've been there basically teaching them how to be soldiers. Now, like you said, this idea that the Ukraine war was a fascist junta is just absolute nonsense. However, Azov, I feel it's getting a bit out of control, because how are the government going to stop them? You did that great piece about their little, their kind of militia roaming around Kiev now. It's just madness.
Yeah, well, and they're able to do it because they have support from the Interior Minister Arsen Avakov and his ministry, and of course the police forces, who they do clash with sometimes. These new street groups that are part of the Azov organization, they do clash with patrol police, for example, from time to time. But ultimately, they have the support of very powerful people in government, and they are believed to have really been kind of brought into the fold to handle the sort of dirty work that the Interior Ministry doesn't want to do itself, and that seems to be their main task in terms of what they do on the street. But they're also creating a very influential political organization. So if you look at the polls, they're not popular nationally, right? And if you remember from 2014 in parliamentary and presidential elections, all far-right political parties did terribly. Some not even garnering 2% of the vote, and really none of them got enough in parliamentary elections for the party to enter parliament. Some of the individual leaders made it on in single mandate districts, but not on their party lists didn't make it, and so nationally support for them is very, very low. However, we're seeing the growth of these groups now in Kiev specifically, and they're being grown not as like this political force, but as this kind of like street muscle. And one of their leaders is Andrei Beletsky, who is a former commander out in Donbass, who is in parliament and whose influence has grown because of his ties to powerful people in parliament and the government. They're going to be a really interesting group to watch over the next year because as they've not really alone garnered much support. They're consolidating. All these far right groups are consolidating, and they're going to form one party, and that's the idea, to put forth one candidate in presidential elections next year and one party for parliament next year, in hopes of getting or growing their power and influence. And it's possible that they could achieve this, just given the fact that they are supported by those people that I mentioned, and there's really no sign that the government wants to crack down on them. They're beating up minorities with impunity. They're receiving government money to educate Ukraine's youth. It's certainly something that is that has, is of great concern to Ukraine observers, who work for humanitarian organizations or journalists like myself. I think that there was a lot of attention on them in recent months because of these attacks, but the attention only comes when there are these attacks. When more needs to be done, I think, to shine a light on these guys, even when there isn't some kind of high profile piece of news.
I remember when I was doing that summer camp thing, and they were trying to pass it off. They said, we're not Nazis, we don't like Hitler, we're just ultra nationalists. Which, in the context of war and what has happened to their country, you can say like, oh, okay, like whatever, do your thing. But obviously, obviously that's not true with Azov. But what we did, we found all of their social media accounts, and every single one of the instructors, bar one, had swastikas, Heil Hitler, doing Sieg Heil. It was crazy, man. It was sad to see, really, because they are very well organized.
Well, and another reason why they aren't cracked down on by police and the authorities is because a lot of these guys are hailed as heroes, like Beletsky and the guys who were a part of the Azov battalion at the very start. They get a lot of support, and they've got a lot of street cred because they were a part of the original group that helped repel Russian-backed attacks in Mariupol and other parts up and down the front line in eastern Ukraine. And to their credit, they did manage to hold their ground or even retake some in certain areas. Now, I think you can do both things at the same time. You can say, hey, they did a good job of doing this 3 years ago, 4 years ago. But also, we need to keep an eye on them and keep them in check because there are guys, like you said, who walk around and are openly neo-Nazi and are openly fascist. Unfortunately, right now there's this attitude in Ukraine where, we put aside all of the bad shit, and hold these people up because of some of the good stuff that they did. Right, and I think you can do and say both, right? You can say that they did a good job once upon a time, but you need to keep people with this kind of ideology in check, right? You don't want these kind of people actually controlling Kiev, and essentially bringing Russia's propaganda to this kind of point of truth.
An old lady once in the Donbass really summed it up for me once. She said, "Look, I don't like their ideology, but those guys stopped my house being shelled by the Russian separatists, so they're all right with me." And I think, like you said, you can't just pretend like, oh well, because they're fascists, they're no good. No, they did a good job on the front line. Like, it's true, and I think we should mention as well, like, Azov is a very small part of the of the combatants fighting at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. No, many of the Azov guys are not on the front. They've moved to the streets of Kiev. There are some who were part of the Azov battalion or part of Right Sector or other kind of far right organizations who are now who did actually agree to be brought into the fold and were spread across several different battalions on the front. So even Donbass battalion, if you remember them from the very beginning, they fractured into two different groups. One is under the control of the Ministry of Defense, and they are commanded by Vyacheslav Vlasenko, I believe, still, and another commander, and they're still out on the front line, and they handle heavy weapons. There are many of them. They're very skilled and very disciplined. Then there is this other group controlled by Semen Semenchenko, who was the original commander of the 1st Donbass Battalion. But they've moved to parliament and the streets, and they're pretty gritty, and they were supporters of Mikhail Saakashvili, and they were a part of this more recent tent camp that, if you remember, last winter popped up and protested against Poroshenko, and were very anti-government. We shouldn't waste too much time on these groups, but I think Azov is the one to watch. Right Sector is out in the east still, but not doing too much. But in terms of reining in Azov, I really think that's that's the biggest issue that Kiev has with doing so, is that a lot of these guys are seen by the Ukrainian public as being heroes, and they don't want to come off as looking like they're cracking down on guys that were heroic, right? I'm not saying they shouldn't. Like, they should. These guys need to be reined in, for the sake of Ukraine's reputation and rule of law. And if Ukraine really does want to show itself as moving westward and becoming more European, certainly these guys have no place, in Ukraine's future, or at least in its government. But it's a tough thing for the government to do. It's not a popular thing.
And what is going on in the Donbass now? What's happening in the separatist regions, I should say? Like, what is happening with the DNR, and what's going on in the LNR? Like, Luhansk, I haven't heard anything come from there for months.
Oh man, it's really hard to get information from Lugansk and Donetsk these days, and journalists have been more or less banned from entering or reporting there since the end of 2015. It was late 2015 the last time I was there, and I just continue to get denied access, just like many of our colleagues do. But we have some reports that do filter out. There's obviously a lot of Lugansk and Donetsk propaganda, and even Russian state media that is able to produce stuff from there. So if you kind of read between the lines, you get a little bit of a sense of what's going on. But and I've got my own contacts and sources that I have over there who I still talk to, fairly regularly, but we can't publish them by name or really base any report on what they say, just because it would put them in danger. But what I hear and what I've come to know from these sources is that things are pretty chaotic politically over there. They've got a new leader in Lugansk as of last year, right? There was this coup that pushed out Igor Plotnitsky, the guy who ran the Lugansk People's Republic for much of its early existence, and then you've got Alexander Zaharchenko still leading the Donetsk People's Republic, but he has and is still been a figurehead only, really. He's not an intelligent man. He is not somebody that Russia likes making public appearances or speaking on behalf of the DNR. Recently, they've been trying to put Denis Pushilin, who's kind of the number two, and he prefers a suit to Zaharchenko's military garb, and he's been doing the kind of official rounds in Moscow, flying to Crimea to meet with their kind of occupation authority leaders down there, Sergei Aksanov in particular. And what I've heard from my sources is that when there are elections in Donetsk, there's going to be some kind of attempt to muscle Alexander Zaharchenko out and put forward Denis Pushilin as the preferred leader of Donetsk. But they've got to do that with some grace. They can't look like they're actually forcing Zaharchenko out. They've got to make it look like he's resigning, or like he's had his tenure and now he's going to go relax in his seized the home that he seized from a Ukrainian family several years ago or whatever, or just put him into retirement or something. But also there were reports recently that he had either been wounded again, or that his old wound had flared up and he was having complications with it. So that also could be a reason to kind of push him aside. So politically, it's pretty turbulent right now. A lot of people in the Donetsk and Lugansk occupied areas are coming to Ukraine to get their pensions, to see family, to seek medical treatment. So there's still this flow of people back and forth, and we hear stories from those people who come across the front line. They meet with journalists, they meet with doctors, they meet with their friends and family, and so we get this information, not third hand or second hand, but sometimes first hand. Just by meeting some of them at the checkpoints as they cross through, or at hospitals when they're seeking care, that sort of thing. So. Part of what they say, if you want to move away from politics and hear a little bit about life there, is that in those areas the Ukrainian hryvnia, the currency there, has all but vanished, and now it's the Russian ruble that's being used. Food, they say, is very expensive. The choices are very, very, very few. A lot of it comes from Russia, of course. So it's no longer Ukrainian beer on the shelves. It's Russian beer. A lot of the meat products and dairy products, they come from Russia. Mostly the Rostov region, which butts up against the Ukrainian border there. People still live very much in fear. There's a curfew in place still. So even though the conflict is nowhere near the level of intensity that it was, there's still a curfew in place, and while that curfew is either 10 or 11 p.m., it's the streets are empty by 6 p.m., 7 p.m. because people want to make sure that they get home in time, before it gets dark, because after dusk, people can disappear, and the police force of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics will just round up whoever they feel like it, take them in for an interrogation, accuse them of being a spy or spotter for the Ukrainian military, and they'll disappear for a day or a week, or sometimes for a much longer period of time. So there's still this kind of iron-fisted rule there. And certainly no jobs. Like you've got some basic shops that are open, and a few of the mines and factories that are open. But for many, there's no work. So it's a pretty dire and depressing situation right now.
Yeah, I remember when I was there, man. I just came away with this feeling, like you just said, this iron-fisted rule. And it really pisses me off when you hear these kind of tankies or these leftists who are saying, oh yeah, go and live in, the DNR, this kind of socialist haven. It's not. It's a hellhole. It's like this totalitarian hellhole. It's absolutely disgusting. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that it's getting worse.
I lived in Donetsk before the war, for 2 full years before the conflict broke out, and I mean it was a great city. It had the Donbass Arena, one of the nicest, most expensive football stadiums to have been built in recent time. Right, the streets were clean, and there were traffic jams. There were swanky restaurants, concerts. Not only Russian stars, but like European stars would come over. There was even an underground kind of gay scene. There you could go to a gay club if you wanted to. There were, people all over. Like the parks were full of people. There were all kinds of things happening, and it was. While it was built up on stolen money, because it was obviously the home of Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine's former president, who was ousted from the Maidan revolution. It was his kind of way of building building up his own home, right? And it did get nicer, and it was a nice place, like not only regionally but like nationally. It was a pretty fun place. There were opportunities there. There were things to do for local people, more than ever before. And then, of course, this war started, and everything went to hell. And half the population fled. The streets are more or less empty. You'll never find a traffic jam there unless it's a convoy of armored vehicles and military trucks, right? Like that's your traffic jam these days. And instead of going to university or having any shot at a future, young folks, choose to either flee to government-controlled Ukraine or to Russia, or join the ranks of some slapdash kind of military for pennies each month. It's pretty grim.
In relation to that, like you said, young lads going and joining the militias in the DNR. I wanted to ask you what your opinion is on what happened to Givi and Motorola, the DNR commanders who died in pretty suspicious circumstances in the last year or so.
Yeah. I mean, there are several theories. Mine is, in a nutshell, the Kremlin kind of cleaning house, getting rid of the most outspoken of the group of separatist fighters or insurgents there, especially those who kind of had reached this sort of cult status and were known for their brutality, right? Motorola and Givi were brutal. I mean, that doesn't even begin to really describe them. I mean, I saw some of the things that they did in person, and I know this isn't a family show, but it's still not, or podcast, but it's still not really the place, I think, to go into like the gruesomeness of the crimes they committed and that I saw them commit. But I think really it was, I think it was probably, or at least most likely to be some kind of Russian special force or a sort of Russian trained or backed kind of special unit that was taking these guys out. In hopes that at some point when Russia and Ukraine are actually ready to sit down and find a settlement to this thing, that there would be people in place who would be willing to negotiate on that side, and not these kinds of guys like Givi and Motorola who would almost certainly protest that and take up arms anyway to fight against any kind of deal, right?
Yeah, they would just start going wild, right? I mean, they had all the men, they had all the weapons as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was Motorola who had a wedding in the middle of the city, and instead of driving away in a limousine, they drove away on an armored personnel carrier. They had anything they wanted at their disposal.
When I was there, the fixer I was working with, she told me this amazing story that, well, she said I was at the swimming pool yesterday and Motorola was there in his swimming trunks with his AK just wandering around the swimming pool. Like, gives you an idea what kind of guy he was,
Yeah, those kinds of scenes were and are normal there. I basically lived in the Ramada, like many journalists did, for months on end in 2014 through 2015 in Donetsk, and it was just the most bizarre place to be, and the strangest mix of people, because you would have the hotel staff, of course, which were locals, and they went out of their way to be polite and smiling and nice, even though they lived in a war zone and they still had to work behind a desk counter and serve people food. And then you had journalists who were coming in from all over the place. You had armed men who would sit down and drink their espresso or order a plate of pasta with while they had their AK over their lap, and then like between dinner and dessert they'd clean their rifle, and then sitting at the bar would be some leggy blonde prostitute eyeing them, and then they'd walk away for an hour or whatever, or come back and then sit down, and they'd come right up to us journalists and ask for a lighter, and we'd have a conversation, and they would tell us how their day was. It was absolutely insane. It's the hotels, it's the restaurants, the swimming pool. These guys really had nothing to live for before the war, and now they're really just living it up. They carry their guns around not only for protection, but really it's kind of it's sort of this like badge of honor, right? Before it was in the territory, miners were kind of like the local heroes, and now not for most of the population, because a lot of the population still doesn't support this war or any side really. But for a lot of people, these soldiers are now they're kind of local heroes, and they walk around with their guns whether or not they need them. They walk around in their uniforms, and it's this. sign that they're worth something. I think that's interesting.
It's a real mess. What do you think? We'll finish it now, but I just wanted to know, what do you think is going to happen, in the next year, in the next, I don't know, whatever, 6 months out there? Because a lot of people are kind of saying, oh, it's going to, the Donbass is going to become the new Transnistria, this kind of forgotten, dormant, but not dormant conflict. What do you think will happen?
Donbass won't become Transnistria, at least not anytime soon, because the fighting's still ongoing. And, it's not, I don't think it's going to go the way of any frozen conflict. At least there is the possibility that could happen, but not for a long period of time. There are still too many people who want to actually fight, and there is still very much an active war going on. In terms of peace, that prospect is a long ways off. Nothing to that effect will happen in the next 6 to 8 months, just because we've got presidential elections in Ukraine coming up in March. So Poroshenko can't sit down with Russia. He can't make any deal right now, because any deal would certainly involve concessions, and he can't look weak to a Ukrainian public who already doesn't approve of him. So nothing will happen, and unless Putin one day decides he wants to completely pull out. I mean, the war could end if he wanted to, but that's not going to happen. What likely would happen is, at some point in the future, if Putin sits down with Poroshenko, there would be some kind of deal made, and there would have to be concessions on both sides. But nothing's going to happen in the next 6 to 8 months because of the presidential election. Poroshenko can't afford it. Putin wants to see who's going to become the next president, because it's possible that he could find someone who's more amenable to his offers when it comes to peace, right? Yulia Tymoshenko is, for example, doing very well in the polls, and she's somebody who he has done business with in the past. The future is grim for Donbass, and it's kind of this area where, nobody really wants Donbass. Like, Ukraine doesn't want it because it sees a lot of it views the people who live under the control of Russia-backed separatists as traitors and separatists themselves. And Russia doesn't want Donbass because it's too costly, and it would also bring with it just too many problems, especially given the amount of weapons that are there and the proliferation of them. Right? It wanted Crimea because it had historical ties to it, whereas Donbass doesn't have the same kind of thing. It doesn't mean the same thing for Russians. So it's these two sides fighting this war of attrition over a region that nobody wants.
Meanwhile, young men dying, every other week or whatever. A real shame. That's brilliant, mate. And where can people, follow your work and keep up to date with what you're doing?
Yeah, right now on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website, my work is up on there. I do some freelance from time to time for others, and of course on Twitter at ChristopherJM is where I put out quite a bit of stuff, including things that don't make it into print.
Excellent. Thank you very much, mate.
Thanks, man. It was good chatting. I can talk about Ukraine forever.
That was Christopher Miller talking about the state of the seemingly forgotten war in East Ukraine, specifically speaking about the problems that the country might have with the militias in the future, and also the lack of news coming out of the Donbass, really, in the separatist LNR and DNR regions. This episode was sponsored by DefensePost.com. I did a little interview with them the other day, actually. You can have a look on there if you want. It's all about Popular Front, why I started it, that sort of thing. I read it back and I thought, I sound like a bit of an arse here, but I don't know, see what you think, it might be alright. Also, as usual, if you want bonus content, bonus episodes, video stuff, merchandise, all sorts, go to patreon.com/popularfront. For the $10 a month tier, I have now started a Discord server where basically everybody can talk about all things Popular Front. We've got all different sorts of things going on in there. It's actually quite interesting. So if you want to be a part of that, have a look, patreon.com/popularfront. To keep up to date with the podcast, follow me on Twitter, that's Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. Also, you can follow the Popular Front Twitter. I post stuff on there now and then. It's Popular Front CO, so at Popular Front CO. just like the website, which is popularfront.co for all the episodes, any updates, that sort of thing. Also, we have an Instagram account now, so you can see some of the various video work we're doing at the moment. Like I said, we're trying to do a documentary and we're nearly there, we nearly finished it off. So that is instagram.com/popular.front. Thank you very much to the $30 Patreon members, because without you lot, I definitely wouldn't be able to do this every week. They are Ryan Sandercock, Stephen R.D. Henderson, Cole Gannon, Joel Tambusi, LH, Aliame Leroy, Daniel Shearer, Joanne Stocker, Margaret Bowling, Teddy Kajetil, and Zachary Hinch. Also this week we got a anonymous donation. Basically, some guy just sent me some money to keep the podcast going and just said, I like what you're doing, please keep it going, whatever. Thank you very much to that anonymous donor. If you want to do that, it's paypal.me/Jake Hanrahan, JakeHanrahan. We would be very grateful for that, because the podcast is costing me a bomb, especially now trying to do some other stuff like docs and what have you. But anyway, it's going to keep going. Music in this episode, the intro was by an artist called Home, and the outro was by Son of Old. Find his SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/son-of-old.